Hi, everybody. Welcome to the table. It's your friendly neighborhood Anton, and we are at comiccon.com. I am in the room, metaphorically speaking, with one of the luminaries, one of the leading scholars in the world for my favorite thing next to my wife, Dungeons and Dragons. I'm with Jon Peterson. Um, this is fantastic. Hello, sir. Thank you so much for taking the time to hang out with me, Jon. It's great. It's so good to see you. You have so many books that live on various shelves throughout my home, cookbooks and recipe cards and historical documentation, and they're all so important and part of sort of this great massive landscape of this hobby that I love. This very equalizing, very important sort of pastime for me. And recently, playing at the World is out. It's coming out soon, and this is from MIT Press, and it's a phenomenal read. My original preview of it, I was talking about how you have all your core books, you have all your game books with your mechanics, and you have the awesome art books that I have. That are delightful. They've kind of collected all of the Dragon magazine covers and the paintings that were used for the different manuals as throughout the years. But this is such a fundamentally beautiful piece of the hobby because it talks about a lot of the sort of the ephemera and the creation of D&D from sort of its genesis in chainmail gaming and war games and how it sort of evolved. It's beautiful. What was sort of your inspiration to kind of start working in this space and do this, because it's so rad?
Oh, well, I mean, I think we're done here. Actually, that's perfect. Let's end on that as a note. That sounds fantastic. I think we covered everything people need to know about this book. No, so yeah, I mean, for me, this obviously, I also like D&D a lot, and I played quite a bit. Less so when I was young, and more so, I guess, in the 90s into the 2000s. And throughout the 2000s, I was running a lot of third edition D&D. And the origin story I often tell of playing at the World is that when World of Warcraft came out, I become like super obsessed with World of Warcraft. A lot of people were at the time, and like some friends of mine effectively staged an intervention and like dragged me off to London to go to like an indie rock festival, actually, as it happens. But like, well, while we were there, we were at the British Museum, and I saw there in a display case this first century AD Roman 20-sided die. And I just had this moment because I've been running a lot of D&D for the last like decade and kind of playing a lot of other RPGs. And I just wondered like how far back everything went and where it all came from, where hit points came from, where experience came from, where, the concept that you would like take a 20-sided die, like that weird Roman 20-sided die, and like roll it against a table of probabilities to determine whether or not a fictional event had happened. And I just went looking for that and read what there was to read about this that I could find anyway. And I got convinced then that there was probably a story to tell here, maybe an untold story. And, I had to go to a lot of trouble to figure out what you would use to tell that story, even in the sense of what the sources were that would reveal that. Even that was kind of pretty opaque at the start. But that led me down the path doing the first edition of Playing the World, which came out in 2012. Now, 12 years later, we are redoing this in two new volumes with new Errol Otis covers for each one, of which this is the first. And I think, I hoped it would be the more accessible of the two. This one, kind of tells the proximate history, right? I mean, it alludes to broader historical things, but it's really about like 1968 to 1976 or so. The second volume is what kind of goes way deep dive into the, prehistory of all this and the different sources that kind of converge to create D&D. So that's where this came from. And it's if you had told me when I was working on this circa like 2007 that in 2024, MIT Press would be doing like a reprint of this as a revised edition, I would have been quite surprised. I had no idea if anybody would ever care.
It's phenomenal to me, the fandom and the way that we've grown. For me, I came into the hobby in a very sort of strange way. I'm disabled. I use a wheelchair. And so I was around a lot of other kids who had varying abilities. and we pilfered dice from board games, and with our action figures created essentially a homebrew dice based system as little kids. That was, this is how far my GI Joe can move. That way, if like Chris can get up and walk around and Anton's in a body cast, at least Chris can move the GI Joe. We know how far it goes. Or like the Ninja Turtle throwing star goes this distance and does this damage. And we worked all of this out as like, and it was very rudimentary and slapdash, but it was a ton of fun. And then when I discovered sort of D&D, I was like, somebody did better math. This is phenomenal. There's a whole culture that exists out there of people who are playing these kind of games. And what I think is, it makes me so passionate, and I'm so grateful for the work you do. It is so important to me, to the culture, is that kids didn't make it right when I was a kid, right? There are definitely kids who were in the hospital in situation who never left, and their stories never got told, and the sort of the collecting of those things, those got lost sort of to the winds. And so I have like Spider Queen and the War Rafts of Corn, these old AD&D modules that people were throwing away because they didn't want to deal with that emotional weight of like, oh, this belonged to somebody who's no longer with us. And I'm like, but we have to preserve these stories, and the work you're doing is such an important piece of preservation, because it's like, these things get lost. They're paper. This was, the computers were around, but like, that's what I love so much about this, is it's like you're able to kind of give this history to those who come after us. And it's such an important thing. And I mean, I cannot stress enough, everybody listening at home, how important this book is. Like, it's so good, and it is accessible. You did a wonderful job. Was that preservation piece something that was in your mind? Because immediately when I found out, I was like, this is amazing. This is great.
I mean, certainly, yes, preservation is one of the main things you'll find that is a thread that runs through all of my projects. I mean, the way that I think I phrase it in the end of the second volume of Playing with the World is that I wanted to try to make these games something that was accessible to and worthy of scholarly attention. And, I don't think, when I started, I did not get the impression either of those things were things that people would say about a game like D&D. And, why? I mean, I think it really wasn't clear at the time I was working on Playing with the World that D&D would survive. If you think about when I was working on the first, edition of it, it was at a time when computer RPGs and MMOs were, so culturally dominant. And, in the 4E era, obviously, there was a lot of question about the direction that the game had taken. And, I mean, it may have been, I was looking at this kind of as an epitaph at the time, which makes it so much more ironic that now doing a second edition of it. Of course, D&D has excelled the previous peaks that, it had reached even in the 1980s, and become something that, has been, I'd say, legitimized, which is a pretty strong word. But I mean, I don't really know how else to characterize the kind of transformation, the way people see it, and their receptiveness to the notion that D&D injected into the culture like a set of ideas that have been so prevalent and so influential. And yeah, I mean, I thought it was really crucial, especially while some of the people who made it were still alive. And bear in mind, when I first started on Playing with the World, people like Gygax and Arneson were still alive, and I could like go see them. Right? Like, but that wasn't going to last forever. And, we've lost so many more people since. And, being able to identify what the sources were that these people made that tell this story, and to be able to lay them out perspicaciously and say, these are, I think, the elements that are important if you want to try to put a story together of how we ended up with this phenomenon. That is the objective of Playing at the World. Yes.
It's so good, and it makes me so happy, in like a genuine way. It's only sitting on my desk right now because I took it from the bedside when I brought it in here, just so I could keep showing it to people, because it's so much fun. It lives next to my bed now, on top of a stack of Dragon magazines. I'm currently going through like 52 because I'm doing some research on Orcus. But I'm a big fan, and I liked the sage advice when they're talking about saints. How do you take a player character away from the player, and what's that conversation look like? Those things appeal to me, because it's like, I mean, this thing is talking about like Gen Con 18, which was before I was even born, and being able to kind of look back and say like, this is a piece of our history. It is part of this. For me, it's a grand equalizer. I can't kick a ball. There's never going to be a day I could run track. I couldn't do gym. There's there's so much of the human experience, even standing in line or walking upstairs, that I am completely barred from. But at the table, we're all so equal, and that's why this hobby is, it's so important to me, because it kind of brings this group of people together. I play weekly with my friends who live, all over LA, and we have one in London, and we're all over the place. But we get together, and we kind of switch off from everybody's kind of got big corporate jobs and big public viewed spaces, whether they're working as a comic artist or a voice actress or whatever. And we all just sit down and we play make-em-ups together. We have our own little violent tea party, and we have a good time. And it's like that equalization, like we're all equal at that table, is so cool. And I really think that you capture a lot of the essence of that in this, talking about it, because it's very frank, right? It's not romanticized. It's very much, there's a very warts and all perspective here, where there's definitely some missteps were made by sort of our pillars, those who created this hobby. Their checks bounced. There were, royalties were not paid in certain instances. There were definitely some tensions. There weren't just false kingdoms fighting each other, but actual tensions between creatives, and that's in this. And it's important that we hear about it, because it's not revisionist, but it's also such a beautiful homage to like where we were. And I think it really sets the tone to where we are now. And I love that you've done this. And the second volume, which I assume is forthcoming, is going to kind of expand on where's that one taking us. Can you tell me a little bit about that, like what we can kind of expect to see in that one?
Sure. So I mean, the original Playing at the World, you can think about it like it was a sandwich that was made up of the two pieces of bread that I've squished together now into the first volume of Playing at the World. So there was like a first chapter that just told the immediate history up until the point D&D came out. And then I spend like 2/3 of the book in a digression. And then at the very end, we come back and we tell the story of what happened after D&D picked up. So think about it like I took the two halves of that sandwich. That's now volume 1. Okay, so what's the digression? The digression is 3 ingredients. If it's a sandwich, there's some cheese and some lettuce and some mustard or something, right? So the first of them is setting, and this focuses on kind of how the sword and sorcery genre in particular was constructed, which requires its own kind of bespoke history of what the critical writers were and kind of why those writers informed D&D. And it picks around at a question that's very hard to answer, but it gives at least some data points about it, of why it was that the first thing we call a role-playing game had a fantasy setting as opposed to a Wild West setting or a science fiction. I mean, it would have been, right? But it looks at some factors that may have influenced that, and it looks at the way that some of the particular elements of D&D, spells and magic items, things like that, came out of that like sword and sorcery tradition. So that's the first of what I call the 3 pillars, different kind of pillars than you were referring to a moment ago, but the second volume is called the 3 pillars. First is setting, the second is system, and the system pillar is where the dive gets real deep, and so deep that there's occasional like hazard tape telling people if this is too deep, feel free to tap out and just like skip ahead. But it's a history of conflict simulation, really like starting with chess, going through the various incarnations of especially German war game designs in the late 18th and 19th centuries that I believe are the places that introduced concepts like the one I was talking about earlier, that you would roll a die against a table of probability to determine whether or not a fictional event happened, introduced the concept that there was a referee of a game and that players would tell the referee like verbally what it is they wanted to do, and the referee would take that and come back with, this is what happened, what would you like to do now? These were all factors in a war game from 1824. So they go back quite far, and kind of showing how we get from that and what the conduits of influence were that brought that back around to D&D is a big part of the second pillar. But it also goes into, for example, how the level and experience system came together, how the hit point system came together, what were the precedents, how similar or different were these from kind of parallels that were evolving in the culture then. Because those are the things, when I think about like experience and levels, we know that they came into D&D from the Blackmore campaign that Dave Arneson had created. And they're among D&D's signature inventions, but nothing's ever without precedent, right? And kind of one of the premises of all of Playing at the World is really that kind of everything is a mashup and it's kind of taking ingredients from different places and, combining them in a counterintuitive way can create a radically, revolutionarily like different experience. So that's all in the second pillar. The third pillar is the hardest one, the shakiest one, the flimsiest one. That's about character and the concept of playing as an individual character, using a character's voice, and kind of how various precedents, including the game diplomacy is one of the big ones, like helped people start thinking about themselves as, I'm going to play somebody who's different from me. I'm going to put myself into the situation of this person and act like them in the context of a game, and kind of what that meant and how we got to where we were in D&D from that. And, the argument is basically these three pillars, right, are what created the conditions necessary for the creation of D&D. And without them, and without kind of all of the things that they offered to the environment of wargamers and science fiction fans, right, of the early 1970s, D&D wouldn't have been possible.
I would buy it yesterday. Like, that just sounds like the most fun read. I am, my heart is going a mile a minute. I'm just excited. Like, that sounds like so much fun. Do we have an expected release for that yet? Do we know when we could maybe think about pre-orders? Like,
you'll be able to pre-order it this fall, I suspect. Well, I mean, think about it. Like, when we did this, remember this is the second edition,
right,
of a book. So we already wrote the book, right, that had that stuff in it. I fixed it up quite a bit because, as you pointed out, there is a lot of new stuff that, between 2012 and 2024 has come to light that kind of informs the new edition. But, I submitted this all as one book, and we had a whole discussion. Should this be one huge book? Because it's over 400,000 words altogether. Or should we split this into 2 volumes? And eventually the consensus was, let's split it into 2 volumes. But it's, for me, and this is something when you work on a lot of publishing projects, as I do, these are things that are just in the mail for years. Like, you wrote them ages ago, and you have to talk about them like they're like brand new when they just came out. But for me, these are things that were done like a long time ago and that we just kind of tinker with a bit here and there to get them on their way to the printing press. So it'll be exciting to have both out, but I'm glad, as somebody who didn't know the first edition, that just reading the first volume of the second edition, like, it worked. That's good feedback. I'm gled to hear that. Just reading this part worked
so well. I grew up in a time where, when I was around family, it was very Southern, right? Very cloistered. So the Satanic Panic lasted much longer where I was than it did in some other places in the world. So, you see TV tropes where kids are hiding magazines, swimsuit posters and stuff under their mattresses. For me, it was, modules and my monster manuals and my fiend folios and stuff. They kind of existed there. It wasn't really until third edition that I could be outwardly playing these games. Everything we had the dice, we had the pen and paper, but it was very much like, oh, we're just making it all up. But, then you're squirreled away with a flashlight kind of reading. So now if it has an ampersand on it, I buy it because I just see it as like, we won, we survived. I have Tim Truman's Warduke tattooed on my shoulder from the original art from the Hearthstone. Because I'm such a fan. I love Warduke in that way. He represents everything to me that I think is like goofy and fun and play about the whole thing. But you've worked on so much, and I just want to touch on little bits and pieces here and there. But there's like there's the flavors of the multiverse, which we love. We have that in the living room because we have a big built-in. That's where all our cookbooks live. And Lores and Legends is great. Art and Arcane is awesome. That's both of those are on the shelf. Heroes Feast, delightful piece. I feel like kind of all of these ephemeral pieces. I work in. I'm a senior journalist for gaming here at comiccon.com. I write for other places. I'm a games director at a publishing company out of Kansas City. Like, I live in this space, and what you're doing in this space is so important, not only to me as a fan, as a lifelong player, but like, I feel like for our culture, for gaming, the work that you're doing, you are really our historian. You're chronicling the events that are taking place in our world in a way that, as somebody who knows, with a degenerative disability, I know that time is not promised. The work that you're doing is very much to me important, and I think to a large collection of us on every side, every aspect of the dice, as it were, who come to the table. Like, what you're doing is amazing, and I can't stress enough that people need to pick this book up. And when Volume 2 drops, they need to pick that book up, because it is part of what we do, and it really matters, and I love it, and I'm so grateful to get the opportunity to thank you for it, because you did good work, man. You did real good work.
I mean, it wasn't all me, right? I should be clear. I mean, you described a lot of things there, like the Art and Arcana and Lore and Legends and Heroes Feast. I had some great co-authors to work with on those, people like Mike Whitwer and Kyle Newman, Sam Whitwer. And, those are really big team efforts. And, doing anything like Art and Arcana, because it's Penguin Random House and it's Wizards, and Wizards is helping, and Penguin Random House is doing editing stuff, and everything really kind of came together on that. That was a phenomenal project to do, and I really love D&D art. You have a War Duke from Tim Truman, no less, like tattooed on your shoulder. I know you do too.
I'm getting Richard Winters' War Duke on my other arm. He did the sketch and sits it over me.
Oh, very nice.
Yeah, so I figured balancing the old and the new, it made total sense, right?
That's amazing. I can't say I have any tattoos of any D&D art on my person. I'm not really a tattoo person, but I certainly have long admired it. And there's a ton more to do. I mean, this is the thing that I really come back to when I look at Art and Arcana or Lore and Legends even. I mean, that just scratched the surface of the amazing stuff that is out there for D&D art. I mean, I regret having done Art and Arcana, we didn't really get to do like a ton of interiors, for example. We mostly had to focus on covers. We mostly wanted to get across things that would be familiar but I mean, I would love to do like 6 more volumes of that. Maybe someday we'll have a chance.
I mean, with the current uprising, I mean, I love seeing, I played WoW, and when it was coming out, I was a big fan, world first, or, day one, not world first, but definitely day one in Pandora for some of those dungeons we were raiding. It was a ton of fun. It was a good time. And it felt like my tabletop space was definitely not as recognized as it is now. And it's very cool to see, like, we've been playing. I mean, I had a campaign that ran from 93 to 2014. A continuous story with like legacy characters and generations, and like changing over, bastions and strongholds and things like that. And I mean, it was for the most part, we had 3 or 4 core players that lasted the entire time. So I mean, it's always been a piece of my world, but it's so cool to be able to go to like Target now and just see like there's core books just hanging out next to like magazines about Pilates, or there's there's like ampersands on the nerd boxes, and you're just like, this is unreal. You could buy a dungeon master and Venger figure next to a Ninja Turtle, just like it was old school. I have the old school War Duke figure framed, but just like the old, back in like 87, where you could get the War Duke figure like Melf and pick them up in the store. It's so cool that we've kind of cyclically come back to it, and I think it's thanks to sort of the streaming work. There's a lot of people out there doing streaming stuff that's very important, and I think there's actual plays, and I think there's probably a lot of cultural factors that are hit that kind of opened up the door for people to start playing again and playing more and connecting in that way at the table. And so it's so cool to see, because it does feel like that Arts and Arcana book, which is awesome, and the Lores and Legends, freaking cool. Like I could see getting 10, 20 more of those. They'd be fantastic. It would be amazing. Just as somebody who's like, oh, let me just pick up this old issue of Dragon. I had almost every issue of Dragon. Then there was a flood. Lost them.
Floods, great despoiler of artifacts.
And that's why, again, everybody listening at home, books are important. You want this stuff goes away. The freak accidents, fires, floods, houses being condemned, bulldozers, I don't know, meteorites. This kind of information is important to have. Like, you don't know when somebody critical fumbles their house building roll, and all of a sudden you lose everything. So the fact that this stuff is being chronicled, hugely important, and such a good read, so accessible, so much fun.
That's good. That's good. No, good feedback. And again, you're too kind, really. I mean, it's And again, there are so many people working on this stuff now. I mean, this is the good news. It's not like it's just me, right? Like there are a lot of people who are writing about this history, and certainly, I'm not going to be doing this forever. To your point, these things, life is impermanent, and like I think the good news is we've probably gotten enough in the can collectively at this point that we're not going to lose institutional memory of the early days at this point. And that's one of the things that I was hoping would happen, that maybe I contributed to in some small way. So, with that, I think we'll be good, because people need to understand where so many of these concepts came from, and who did them, and why they did them, and why they were cool, and why they took over the world. And yeah.
It's amazing, man. I appreciate it. I would love to have you back whenever you have time to talk about a myriad of other things. But thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. Thank you so much for what you do. Feel free to thank the people that you work with. They're also super awesome. And I could go and gush about them for hours as well. But seriously, everybody at home, playing with the world, it's fantastic. You want it as part of your collection. If you've ever rolled dice, or even if you haven't, if you just like history, or want a piece of pop culture that you can digest in a way that's meaningful, this is a book for you. You pick it up. So again, Jon, thank you. I've been Anton. This is Comic-Con.com. We'll see you next time.